Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Wolfach, and I'm the Charlottesville Area Association of Realtors President. On behalf of CAAR, I would like to welcome our members, as well as realtors and industry partners from around the Charlottesville area and beyond. CAAR is committed to modeling diversity and inclusion for the entire community and to maintaining an inclusive environment with equitable treatment for all. To empower realtors and affiliates to address racial injustice in our community and around the nation, CAAR, in partnership with the Women's Council of Realtors Blue Ridge chapter, is thrilled to present a virtual diversity and inclusion series. This series is made possible by a $5,000 National Association of Realtors diversity. Each session of the three-part series has a specific objective and one or more top-notch speakers. This series is our opportunity to have an open and safe dialogue about diversity and inclusion as it relates to our local community and the association. In addition to the speaker series, CAAR has also developed a diversity and inclusion project team whose responsibilities include, but are not limited to, raising awareness of how discrimination can play out in a systematic fashion in the real estate industry, and guiding the association to lower barriers for minority groups to participate in the real estate industry and within the association. At this time, I would now like to invite Quentin Beckham, Chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Project Team, as well as CAAR President-elect, to introduce our speaker for Session 1, Awareness, What You Don't Know.
Thank you, Tom. Richard Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. He's a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In addition to his recent book, The Color of Law, he's the author of many other articles and books on race and education, which can be found at his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute. We will be sure and share this web address with you following today's session. Previous influential books include Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Improvement to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap, and Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. As you listen to Mr. Rothstein, we encourage you to ask questions of him by entering in the question and chat box to the right. We will address questions at the end of Mr. Rothstein's presentation. Richard, I'm thrilled and honored to have you with us today to start off our series, and it is my pleasure to hand over the session to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation this afternoon. As you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. That movement began by challenging residential segregation in elementary and secondary schools, first, of course, in colleges and universities, and then banning segregation, legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision of the Supreme Court. And that Brown decision gave impetus and stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists, people who engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that struggle. By the end of the 1960s, really, that civil rights movement, people lost their lives in it, of course, but it succeeded in abolishing segregation and lunch counters, buses, public transportation of all kinds, public accommodations, employment. But yet, it left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all black and mostly black. The civil rights movement had persuaded an effective group of decision makers in this country, citizens, that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. How can it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all, having come to that understanding of the evil of segregation? Well, partly, I guess, it's easy to understand. It's harder to undo segregation in neighborhoods than to undo segregation in lunch counters. Pass a law prohibiting segregation in restaurants. The next day you sit anywhere you want in a restaurant. But you pass a law prohibiting segregation in neighborhoods, and the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, blacks and whites, Northerners, Southerners, is we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for not redressing segregation of neighborhoods, not really doing anything about the fact that we're an apartheid society when it comes to neighborhoods. The excuse we give ourselves, the rationalization that we give ourselves for not dealing with this goes something like this. We tell ourselves that racial segregation in lunch counters or buses or public accommodations, that was all done by government. The federal government was doing it. It was a Fifth Amendment violation, a civil rights violation. And we had an obligation as American citizens to do something about it. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation. Again, we had an obligation as American citizens to do something about this civil rights abuse. Residential segregation, though, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. We tell ourselves that residential segregation wasn't created by government. It's not a civil rights violation. It didn't violate the Constitution. It was done by private individuals, homeowners and landlords, bigoted, but refusing to sell homes or rent homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it was because of actors in the private economy, like real estate agents or banks, that discriminated in how they carried out their work. Not government, just private individuals, private businesses. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because blacks and whites just like to live with each other. The same race, we feel more comfortable that way. We'd rather live with others with the same skin color. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just the result of income differences. On average, African American families have less income than whites, so many of them can't afford to move to middle-class white neighborhoods. All of these individual, personal, bigoted, but nonetheless non-governmental decisions is what created natural segregation of neighborhoods. And we tell ourselves that what happened naturally, what happened by accident, can only unhappen by accident. We may think it's too bad, but we don't feel any obligation to do anything about it because it's not a civil rights violation. Well, I spent most of my career before I got engaged in the topic of this book studying education policy. And I came to understand that the policy that we were following in this country, the education policy we were following in this country, made no sense. We had this theory. It was enacted into federal law in 2001. The theory was that the reason that African American children in particular had lower average achievement than whites was because teachers just had low expectations of black children. They didn't try very hard. And if only we could make teachers try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. And we passed a law, as I said, in 2001, requiring children to be tested every year and publishing those test scores and shaming teachers and eventually holding them accountable for not getting higher achievement of African American children. And the law predicted that in just a few years, the achievement gap would disappear. It was a ludicrous theory. It turned out to have no basis in reality. It didn't succeed. And I tried to explain in many of the columns and articles I was writing at that time why this theory was so unfounded. I remember writing a column about asthma, for example. African American children in low-income neighborhoods, you may know, have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. They have asthma at 4 times the rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more dilapidated buildings, more untended dirt lots, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, chances are greater than for a child who doesn't have asthma. Then the asthmatic child may be up at night wheezing, come to school sleepless the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, except one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement just from being sleepier. And I went through example after example of these kinds of conditions that African-American children in low-income neighborhoods come to school with, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity or overcrowding. All of them contribute a little bit to the achievement gap. When you add it up, you've got the achievement gap pretty much explained. There are some teachers, of course, who have low expectations, but that doesn't explain the achievement gap. And then I began to realize that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. But what happens when you have a school where every child is coming to school with one or more of these conditions? How can you ever pass a law that requires those schools to achieve at the same level of schools where children come to school healthy and well-rested, well-nourished, in economically secure homes? Of course, you can pass a law like that, but you can't expect it to succeed. Well, we call those schools where we concentrate children with those kinds of disadvantages in single schools, we call them segregated schools. And schools today are more segregated than they have been at any time in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So as an education policy writer, I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was a school problem. And I began to look into it and read into it. And then in 2007, I read the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court had evaluated a program of 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those school districts had a very trivial school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school their child would attend within the district. But if the choice was going to exacerbate segregation, that choice wouldn't be given as much weight as that of a child who would, that choice wouldn't be given as much weight as the choice of a child who would help to minimize segregation. There's a trivial program. How often do you have a situation where you have perhaps one place left and you have to choose between a black and white child? But the Supreme Court evaluated this program, denounced it. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained that it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he said the reason they're segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And the neighborhoods they're located are segregated, he said, for purely private reasons, because of bigoted homeowners or landlords or real estate agents or banks or people just wanting to live with each other of the same race or income differences. He gave a name to this. He said we have de facto segregation. That's something that violates the Constitution. Government didn't do it. And he said if you have de facto segregation, the government is prohibited from doing anything to fix it. Well, as I said, this decision was based on 2 school districts, Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky. And I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky some years before. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively. He had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. That African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, a good job, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner, his friend in this all-white suburb of Shively, bought a second home in his community, resold it to the African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop them. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police protected that activity as well. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence, the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the prosecutors, the courts are all aligned to enforce the residential racial boundaries of Louisville, I began to look into it further, and I found there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases in this country. I'm not exaggerating in those numbers. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases, not just in the border states like Kentucky, but in the North, Midwest, south, west, of police-protected mob violence, driving African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these police-protected mob violence, frequently organized and led by police, was a civil rights violation, not de facto segregation, a violation of the Constitution that we've never accepted a responsibility to remedy. And then I began to look into it further, and I found that it wasn't just police-sponsored violence in violation of the 14th Amendment that created, sustained, and perpetuated the segregation that we have in this country today, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies with explicit racial intent that contributed to creating the segregation that we know. All of these policies violated the Constitution. The notion of de facto segregation, I concluded in this book, is utter nonsense. We have an unconstitutional system of racial segregation that is as much a civil rights violation as the segregation of buses or water fountains, and that we have an obligation as American citizens to remedy. Well, let me spend a few minutes this afternoon describing some of the chief federal policies that the government followed in the mid-20th century to create and sustain and reinforce, perpetuate segregation. One of them, perhaps the best known, is that of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the post-World War II period, to suburbanize the entire white working class population, get them out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. We were not a suburban country when the federal government started this program. The only people living in suburbs were affluent people. Working class, lower middle class people had to live in cities because all the jobs were located near deep water ports or railroad terminals where factories could get their parts and ship their final products. And workers typically didn't have automobiles to get to work, so they had to live close enough to the downtown factory district so that they could walk to work, take short streetcar rides. Well, the federal government wanted to get whites out of these neighborhoods as the highways began to be built, as they began to get automobiles. And so it created a program to move whites only out of urban areas into exclusive white suburbs of single-family homes, creating a white noose around every metropolitan area in this country. You're familiar with these suburbs. They exist in every metropolitan area. Perhaps the most famous of them is Levittown, east of New York City. You've probably heard of that one. 17,000 homes in one place. The builder, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital needed to buy the land, build the houses in this area east of New York City. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money. We weren't a suburban country, as I said. The banks thought that you'd have to be crazy to build a subdivision like that. Nobody's going to buy them. Nobody wants to leave the cities. The only way that William Levitt, could get the capital to buy the land and build 17,000 homes was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the post-World War II period, submitting his plans for the development, the construction materials he was going to use, the layout of the streets, the architectural design, and a commitment he had to make to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration that he would never sell a home to an African American. The FHA and VA even required Levitt and these other builders around the country to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working in the VA or FHA. This was written policy of the federal government. The FHA had an underwriting manual distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders to develop single-family home suburbs. The underwriting manual said you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee an application of a developer for a loan who was going to sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a developer who was going to build an all-white subdivision or project if that was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. In my book, The Color of Law, I have a photograph of a 6-foot high, half-mile long concrete wall that a developer in Detroit, developer of an all-white neighborhood in Detroit, was required to put up by the Federal Housing Administration in order to separate his development from a nearby African-American neighborhood before the government would guarantee his bank loans. As I said, this notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. It was on this basis that the country was suburbanized with a white noose around every metropolitan area, with African Americans left behind. They had jobs, unable to take advantage of the same opportunities. Those homes in these subdivisions all across the country in the mid-20th century were inexpensive. They were modest working class homes. They sold for about, in today's money, about $100,000. As you all know, those homes no longer sell for $100,000. Not in Charlottesville, not in Levittown, not in San Francisco, not in Los Angeles, not in Chicago or Detroit or anywhere else. Those homes sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 today, in some places $1 million or more. The white working class families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the appreciation in the value of their homes, the equity they gained. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, unemployment, or medical situations. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments of their own to move into single-family homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit racial federal policy from participating in this wealth-generating program. The result is that today, while African American incomes are about 60%, 60% on average family incomes of white family incomes, you'd think that if there was a 60% income ratio, African Americans would also on average have wealth that's about 60% of the wealth of whites. You can save the same amount of money from the same income. But in reality, while African American family incomes are about 60% of white family incomes, African American household wealth is about 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced by the federal government in the mid-20th century and that's never been remedied, never attempted to be remedied. That wealth gap is a primary ongoing determinant of the racial inequality that we have today that effectively prohibits African Americans from having down payments, from having the wealth to be able to move into more highly resourced neighborhoods or even to improve their own neighborhoods. That wealth gap and the segregation that it reinforces is responsible not only for the achievement gap in schools that I described before, which results in concentrating the most disadvantaged children in single schools. It's also responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because in large part they live in less healthy neighborhoods, the same pollution that I described before that causes asthma in their children, less access to grocery stores that sell healthy food. That wealth gap and the segregation that it's responsible for also is a cause of the police abuse that we've spent so much time talking about in the last couple of months after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The mass incarceration of young African American men. I'm not saying that the police wouldn't act in discriminatory fashion if we didn't have segregation, but it's much, much greater as a result of segregation, because when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs, no access to the transportation to get to good jobs, no access to schools that are high achieving, it's inevitable that those young men will be engaged in confrontations with the police. The police are charged with controlling the low-income population of those neighborhoods, using tactics that would never be tolerated in white neighborhoods. That's another cause of another result of the unconstitutional segregation that we've created. And I think that the segregation that we've created has another impact, which is even more distressing, more frightening, more powerful. And that is the very, very dangerous political polarization that we have in this country today, that largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop, maintain the common national identity that's necessary to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to empathize with each other, to understand each other's life experiences? It's a very, very frightening consequence of the segregation we've created. Well, let me describe one other policy that the federal government created. There were many of them, and many of them at the state and federal level as well. But one other that the federal government created was public housing, which I know that many of us misunderstand. I did before I did this research. We think of public housing as a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men, I described a few minutes ago, without jobs in the formal economy. Lots of interactions with the police, lots of deteriorated buildings. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country during the New Deal, in the Roosevelt administration and the Depression. The first civilian public housing was built in 1933 by the Public Works Administration, and everywhere that the federal government built public housing during the New Deal, it segregated it, creating separate projects for African Americans, separate projects for whites, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. I mentioned before that most working class, lower middle class families in those days lived in the same downtown urban areas. Many of them were integrated. The very first public housing project in this country's history was built in 1933 by the Public Works Administration, a New Deal agency. It was located in Atlanta, a neighborhood called the Flats. It was an integrated neighborhood, about half white and half black. Atlanta had segregated lunch counters and segregated schools and segregated restaurants, but it had broadly integrated neighborhoods because workers, as I said, had to live in roughly the same places. Excuse me. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Atlanta, the Flats, demolished housing, and built a project for whites only. The African Americans who were displaced by that project had to double, triple up with relatives, find less adequate housing elsewhere. Throughout the country, the federal government created segregation, frequently for the first time, with its public housing program. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish, said he dated a Jewish girl. It's not surprising, the integrated high school and an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, and with other projects also segregated elsewhere in Cleveland, perpetuated, created, sustained a pattern of segregation that exists today. In The Color of Law, my book, I like to talk where I can about self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than you are in Charlottesville. One of them I talk about is Cambridge, Massachusetts. Perhaps you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. But the Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, and with other projects elsewhere in the Boston area, created and perpetuated and sustained a segregated pattern that exists to this day. This is how the West Coast in particular got segregated. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war industries. Hadn't existed during the Depression. The jobs that they took in war industries, mostly in aircraft and in shipbuilding. The federal government, if it wanted the planes and the ships to be produced, it had to find housing for these workers, and it did. These were not poor people. like the projects that were built in the Depression by the Public Works Administration, not for poor people, for working families. The federal government, during World War II, built housing for these war workers, and everywhere it built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for whites and blacks war workers, frequently people who are working in the same war plants, the same shipyards, the same aircraft carrier factories, but segregated housing, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. On the West Coast, there were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II. We call it the Second Great Migration, was the movement of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states into elsewhere in the country. And the Second Great Migration was the first time that African Americans moved in large numbers to the West Coast. In San Francisco, a center of shipbuilding on the West Coast, the federal government built 5 projects for war workers, 4 for whites only, 1 for African Americans, placed in the district that later became the Black neighborhood of San Francisco. And the federal government followed the same program during the war in Seattle and in Portland and in Los Angeles, up and down the West Coast. That's how segregation was created in those places. It did not exist prior to these war plants, and it would not have existed otherwise. Well, there were many, many other policies followed by the federal, state, and local governments to create segregation. There were tax exemptions given to nonprofit organizations, churches, universities that explicitly created segregation in their neighborhoods. In my book, I describe the University of Chicago, tax-exempt institution, that had an office in the office of the presidency whose job it was to get neighborhoods to adopt neighborhood resolutions, neighborhood agreements, in which neighbors had the right to sue each other if they ever sold a home to an African American in those neighborhoods surrounding the University of Chicago. Another unconstitutional act by the federal government. Many policies at the state level as well. Highways that were beginning to be built in the 1950s were routed by local officials for the purpose either of creating a boundary between a barrier between black and white neighborhoods. Perhaps the best example of that is the Dan Ryan Expressway that runs through the south side of Chicago, separating black and white neighborhoods. Or in some cases, they ran those highways through black neighborhoods in order to purposely displace black residents so that they would move farther away from downtown areas. These were explicit racial policies. Miami is a good example of that, a thriving black neighborhood called the Overtown neighborhood in Miami was destroyed when I-95 was routed specifically to destroy that neighborhood. The policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. Policy experts know them, housing experts know them, think tanks develop a report after report about the kinds of policies we should follow to fix this outrageous, unconstitutional, segregated pattern. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that is going to make it as uncomfortable to maintain segregated patterns in neighborhoods, to fail to administer those policies that we know exist, as the civil rights movement made it uncomfortable to maintain segregation in restaurants and lunch counters and buses in the 20th century. I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders to create a new national committee to redress segregation in housing. It will be based on creating local civil rights groups that will begin to address the segregation of their communities. Let me just describe a few of the policies that could be enacted that, as I say, are well known, but for which there is now no political support in the absence of a civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable not to adopt them. We should, for example, have an affirmative action program in housing, subsidizing African Americans to move into communities that are now unaffordable to them, but that would have been affordable to them when those communities were developed for whites only in the post-World War II period. Those subsidies might have to be substantial, but they're absolutely constitutionally required as a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. We have policies at the lower end of the income scale for low-income families, disproportionately minority. Perhaps the biggest of these is the low-income housing tax credit, a subsidy to developers to build housing units for lower-income families. It's administered by the Treasury Department. The low-income housing tax credit Treasury Department regulations place a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit units in already low-income neighborhoods. It doesn't say it's for the purpose of reinforcing segregation, but that's its effect. That's crazy. It's not that we shouldn't build more low-income, good quality low-income housing in low-income neighborhoods. We should be building it in all neighborhoods, not with a priority on reinforcing segregation. The same thing is true of the Section 8 program, voucher program, with which you're probably familiar with, subsidy to families to enable them to afford to buy, to rent homes in, that they otherwise couldn't afford at the average rent for a metropolitan area. But that program also reinforces segregation today. It could easily be modified so that it doesn't. We could prohibit discrimination on the part of landlords against Section 8 vouchers. Today, landlords can perfectly lawfully refuse to sell to someone simply because they receive part of their rent as a subsidy from the federal government. Refuse to rent to someone, I mean. That clearly reinforces segregation. Virtually the only place the Section 8 voucher can be used is in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. So the policies, as I say, are well known to do this. Perhaps the biggest one at the local and state level is zoning ordinances that make it even difficult, even if it weren't for the priority that the Treasury Department was placing on putting low-income units in low-income neighborhoods. Even if it weren't for that priority, it's very hard to find places to put those units in higher opportunity communities, because once they were created as segregated bastions of whites only, those suburbs frequently adopted ordinances that prohibited the construction of anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes. Those ordinances, zoning ordinances, don't only keep out low-income families, they keep out working-class families, middle-class families who can't afford now to live in communities that have appreciated the value. Disproportionately minority teachers and nurses and construction workers, none of whom can afford to live in the places where they work. Those zoning ordinances that perpetuate an unconstitutionally created segregation should be deemed unconstitutional simply because they perpetuate an unconstitutionally created situation. Well, as I say, the policies are well known. It needs a new civil rights movement to implement and demand the implementation of these policies. As I say, I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders, fair housing advocates, to create a new national committee to redress segregation, to create local civil rights committees to take up these issues. We're going to launch it fairly soon. If any of you who are listening or watching today want to be on the list to receive an announcement of the launch of that committee in your own community, just send me an email note and I'll be glad to put you on that announcement list. With that, I want to close and thank you for your attention, and I'd be glad to take questions for as long as you have time for. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing your insight. You've certainly done a lot of studying. I'm humbled to realize how much I don't know, even after reading your book, especially after hearing you speak. I think one of the things I'm seeing as the questions come rolling through, it feels like the issue of generational wealth as we've moved forward in time continues to compound and affect the Black population and community in keeping them further away from achieving any form of equity. And understanding that the longer we wait, the worse this gets. If there was one thing that we could do as an organization and as an association of realtors right now that would have the biggest impact, what do you see that as being from all of your study and your point of view?
Well, I'm going to tell you something that's difficult. We need more than just diversity within the real estate industry. We need actions to undo the segregation that the real estate industry contributed to create. I recently wrote a a column, an article in the New York Times, which I focused on a community in California, a segregated all-white community, where we can identify the real estate agency, the banks, the developer that created, under federal government supervision and requirement, a segregated white community. It's now unaffordable to minority families. In this article, I described how those institutions, the real estate agency, the bank, the developer, should be setting up its own private down payment assistance fund to enable more African Americans to move into communities from which they've been previously excluded. That's one thing that the real estate industry could do, and many of the real estate agencies that contributed, that cooperated with the government, they weren't required to cooperate. They could have refused to cooperate in this policy. As you know, the National Association of REALTORS at the time had a code of ethics that prohibited real estate agencies from selling to African Americans in white neighborhoods. So it's not just the federal government. I don't want to imply that real estate agents and banks and developers were unwilling participants in this system. So both public and private institutions have an obligation to redress. And there's an analogy. After World War II, the German government established a reparations fund for survivors of the Holocaust, but German firms that employed slave labor in service of the Nazi goals also set up private reparations funds for victims. So this is a joint program. Let me mention something that doesn't cost money. One of the things that I'm critical of the real estate industry of doing today is it reinforces segregation by directing families to school districts on the basis of a misleading identification of quality schools. Test scores, we know, as I said at the beginning of my talk, I was an education policy analyst. I know, but not just me. Education analysts all know that test scores are not a reflection of the quality of a school. They're primarily the reflection of the educational level of the parents in a district. So by directing families to communities that have so-called better schools that are measured primarily on the basis of their test scores, and I'm talking about Zillow and great schools and realtors who use those in the multiple listing units, multiple listings, who use those test scores to identify good neighborhoods, are perpetuating and reinforcing segregation. A good school is not one with high test scores necessarily. There are many schools with lower test scores that are much better schools. A good school should be evaluated, for example, on the basis of whether it has a well-rounded curriculum, whether it doesn't just focus on math and reading, but has a well-rounded curriculum, on whether it's a diverse school, both in its faculty and in its student body. Those are measures of good schools, to teach people, young children, to come out of those schools with good citizenship qualities, civic values, the ability to get along with others of different races and ethnicities. That's the measure of a good school. And we're not directing customers of real estate agencies to those kinds of schools. We're directing them to schools that are more segregated because their test scores are high, simply because the parents are well educated. So that's another thing that we could do to improve the way we do business in this industry.
So you've been studying this for a long time, and I know that the book is relatively recent, having been published just over 3 years ago. Do you feel like that has made an impact and that you've reached people? I'm constantly hearing from agents we've shared it with how much they've learned, how much has gone on that they didn't know. And I'm curious, do you see that having any sort of impact in all of the issues that you found over the last 3 years?
Well, if I hadn't published that book, you wouldn't have invited me to speak to you today. So it must be having some kind of impact. No, it's been stunning, the reception of this book. People always say, how come I didn't know this history? I was never taught this in school. You know, as you may know, in the book, I devote a section to reviewing the textbooks that are used to teach American history in high schools all across the country. Those textbooks lie about this history. I'm not exaggerating. They perpetuate the myth of de facto segregation. They use the term. They talk about the great work that the government did in creating the suburbs for working class families, never mentioning it was for whites only. They talk about the great work that the government did in creating a housing, a high quality public housing for workers in the Depression who could afford to pay rent, but for whom no housing was available, never mentioning that it was on a segregated basis. And it's not surprising that people didn't know this history, and they're stunned when they learn it. As I say, I call it a forgotten history. Because people at the time knew very well what was going on. If you were a middle-class family and you were white and directed to an all-white public housing project, whereas across town there was an all-black public housing project, you knew what the government was doing. It wasn't like it was a secret. If you bought a home in one of these segregated suburbs for whites only, you knew that your deed that was certified by the FHA prohibited you from renting or reselling to an African American. So this was not a hidden history, it's a forgotten history. But it's also not just my book that's awakening the American public to the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow to an extent that's never before been known. We're having a more accurate discussion about these issues than we ever have had before in American history. As you know, better than I do, I'm up in the north, but you know that there are white elected Southern politicians now who are removing statues to commemorate the defenders of slavery. That was unheard of just a few years ago. So we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow than ever before. My book has contributed to it, but it's certainly not the only one. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, a new book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste. There's a lot of literature. If you look at the bestseller lists, almost all of them are about race these days. So we're having an awakening. It hasn't yet moved into action, but it's created the foundation for action. We can't have action if we don't have this understanding. So I'm very hopeful that, and let me mention one other thing, interrupt myself. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement, 25 million Americans engaged in demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd, and most of those were whites, also unheard of until the recent past. So we're having this conversation. I'm hopeful that a new civil rights movement will emerge from it. It'll be more than just conversation and learning. And as I say, we're about to launch an effort to stimulate that in different communities.
I know it would seem, as we go back through time, laws alone are not enough. And you certainly point out in your book, and we can see statistical measures, that laws that have been promulgated to support equality have in fact failed at that. And it would seem like you need to pair laws with social movement, and then together those things move forward. That being said, what's your sense? We have an opportunity for a new Supreme Court justice. The Supreme Court has moved us in ways as a nation that we might not have done on the same time frame as our own. And what would you say is more important? Do you feel like the legal governmental side is more important, or is the social movement side more important?
I think by far the social movement side is more important. The legal governmental side responds to popular pressure. The Supreme Court, despite the protestations of each of its members, is a political body. You know, the same Supreme Court justices who supported the separate but equal theory prior to Brown then decided that separate but equal is a violation of the Constitution in 1954. The Supreme Court has flipped on issues of racial equality and the 5th and 14th Amendments that are designed to ensure it many times in our nation's history. And if there's a powerful social movement, it will flip again. for Chief Justice John Roberts to say in that decision I talked about before, that the segregation of Louisville, Kentucky was de facto without government participation is utter nonsense. It's not because he doesn't know this history. It's because he hasn't been forced to confront it. And if he were forced by social movements, by public pressure, to confront that history, he would have to agree that what I called before, an affirmative action program on housing is completely justifiable constitutionally and required, not just justifiable, but required.
It seems like a lot of, when we go to speak to this to our peers, and that leads us to have persons like you to speak to us as well, we're frequently met with this sensation of, well, I came from a really hard place in life and look where I've gotten. And that seems to be one of our big hurdles that not every person we talk to, but it's one of the ones that takes what is a strong movement from being a massive movement. And what would your response be to someone who is white and might have started from someplace less than stellar, but their response is, I don't understand why my Black counterpart can't get to where I am. They have all the same opportunities that I do.
Well, first of all, as I indicated in my talk, they don't have the same opportunities. There's an enormous gap in wealth and in income, but there are many African Americans who are successful despite having started from very impoverished backgrounds and segregated communities. There's a distribution of outcomes in every group. There are always going to be some people who are going to achieve at higher levels than people who are seemingly similar in their origins, and some people who are going to achieve at lower levels than most people who are seemingly similar in their origins. The difference between African Americans and whites is that those distributions overlap very little. The mean of African Americans and their opportunities is so much lower than that of whites that the share of African Americans who achieve at the level that's far above that of the typical white person is smaller. None of these things I've talked about, for example, the example I gave of asthma. More African American children have asthma for the reasons I've talked about than white children. Doesn't mean that some children with asthma don't achieve at very high levels, but it's a lot harder for an African American child, or the chances are much less that an African American child is going to achieve at a high level than a white child, simply because the rate of asthma is higher. And as I said, there are so many of these conditions. So it's not that nobody achieves above the mean. It's a well-known statistical proposition that there's a distribution of outcomes for any characteristic.
One of the questions that we're getting from multiple sources, the wealth gap that we've created over hundreds of years and multiple generations of what I think of as white affirmative action is just staggering. And one of the premises of your book is that we have a Supreme Court case regarding reparations to do something in a very large way to help stimulate shrinking this gap, even though we know we can't cure it. And do you feel like we're making any move in that direction, and that's something that can set up? Will it just appear out of the blue, or are there parts and pieces leading us there that you're seeing come into place?
Well, I think it's more productive to talk about remedies, policies, rather than reparations. Some of the things we need to do will be quite expensive. You might think of them as reparations. The example I gave before about the necessity of subsidizing the movement of African Americans into neighborhoods that are now unaffordable, but that they should be in had they not been unconstitutionally excluded. That's an expensive policy. But many of the things that we need to do don't cost a thing. Prohibiting suburbs from maintaining exclusionary zoning ordinances doesn't cost anything. Doesn't cost anything to change the priorities of the low-income housing tax credit program. So there are many things that we can do. Some are expensive and you might think of them as reparations. Some of them are cost-free. So we have to broaden our concept of what's necessary to fix this beyond simply spending some money from the federal treasury. That's necessary. It's a necessary part of it, but we need to do much, much more than that.
And certainly many of my Native Americans would tell you they would rather have other things than money in a land grant. I'm running out of questions. We're coming near the end. And I'm just curious, you have a captive audience of really excited and energized people in a city that has a very specific history with racism in social media and the news. And there are days I feel like we're ahead of the curve and days where I feel like we're significantly behind. What would be one piece of advice or one thing you would really suggest us to focus on for Charlottesville that has been such a center of this movement, both ahead and backwards?
Well, for the real estate industry, I would focus on the things I talked about earlier. I will give you the link to that article that I mentioned before that uses this community in California as an example. The real estate industry has an opportunity and an obligation, I think, to assist financially African Americans explicitly racially, because they were explicitly racially excluded to purchase homes in higher opportunity neighborhoods. I mentioned before the use of misidentifiers of school quality as a way of reinforcing segregation. I think that I assume in Charlottesville there is a chapter of NAREB, the Black Real Estate Agents Association, and I think there should be much more collaboration and sharing of listings, not simply on paper but in practice, between Black and white realtors when they have an opportunity to market properties. So those are some of the things I think can be done. A down payment assistance is something that is not, I didn't mean to say it's only the responsibility of the private sector. Charlottesville itself, the community, should be creating. There are many communities in this country that have done that. They've created down payment assistance funds. They try to do it on pretending to be it's a non-racial program because they don't want to get challenged legally. So they restrict it to first-time home buyers, or maybe people who have lived in historically red line neighborhoods. That's one way of targeting it a little bit more appropriately. But that's something that both the city as well as private institutions should do.
I know as we've gone through this session here today, we have right around 100 folks that have attended, many from Virginia, but also from the National Association of REALTORS and folks that are board members and designees there. Amongst us, we're having many conversations on how to call out incidents of racism in the moment when we witness to them and not stand aside, as well as address those that are systematic that will continue on their own without us, unless we try to stop them. We so much appreciate your insight and your time with us today. I'm sure that your schedule in this period of time has become amazingly full, and that you would take some time today to meet with us is just really stunning and speaks to your commitment to this issue. And I hope one day that we can join you in a little more of a celebration of a victory. And
well,
with that,
I wish I could have been there in person, but in this period of time, it's not possible. Yeah,
I understand. And in some ways, it's been a help. We can see so many more people in this venue than we might be able to otherwise. So I am going to pass off at this time to the Women's Council of Realtors Blue Ridge President, Ann Burrows, for her closing comments.
Thank you, Quentin. Thank you so much. On behalf of CAAR and the Women's Council of Realtor Blue Ridge, I want to thank you for joining this fantastic first program in the series of diversity and inclusion. And we're planning on continuing the conversation with the second session, which is called Education, Changing Perspective and Behavior. And that is going to be held on Tuesday, October 27th from 2 to 3:30. It's going to feature 3 local experts on the subject matter, which are going to be Charlene Green from the Piedmont Housing Alliance, Allison Leaney from Allison and Partner, and Charm Bullard from the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities. So I hope you can join us for that. CAAR and Women's Council Blue Ridge are free to attend this event for free, and there's a registration fee of $5 for everybody else, which is going to go to the Boys and Girls Club of Central Virginia. Also, CAAR members, there's going to be a short evaluation survey that is going to be sent at the conclusion of this session. I hope you will fill it out. It's going to provide important feedback to help the diversity and inclusion project team develop future programming. So thank you again for joining us on this glorious first day of fall, and have a great day.